We acknowledge the Yagara and Kaurna nations as traditional custodians of the land on which we work, live and learn, and their continuing connection with the land, waters and community. We pay our respects to them and their elders past and present.
All content related to this program is for general informational purposes only and contains stories and discussion around mental health that may be disturbing to some listeners. If you are concerned about yourself or someone you know, please seek professional and individual advice and support. More details are contained in our show notes.
I am a person who looks out and takes things in a lot. I think I'm quite a positive thinker. I've always been inducted into the power of positive thinking by my family, or particularly my father. And I think, though, it's really looking how things can come together and match, and not being prepared to stick with what's there, and really just pushing on, listening to what people say, listening to what the needs are, and getting on and doing something about it.
That's the Florey Institute's Professor Leanne Carey, world-leading Australian neuroscientist in occupational therapy and stroke rehabilitation and recovery. And this is Reframe of Mind,
where we deep dive into discussions about mental health, joined by some of Australia's leading minds to expand our understanding of the world and ourselves.
Because we don't exist in a vacuum, and the way we talk about mental health shouldn't either.
And we're your hosts, Louise and Andy Leroy. Andy, you know, we have had a bit of a crusade against toxic positivity since episode 1 in Reframe of Mind.
Yeah, and to be fair, they did win an award, so it hasn't all been bad for toxic positivity.
Good throwback there. If you haven't heard episode 1 yet, toxic positivity does win the Angsty of the year, sponsored by Panacea.
Not sure who's going to win it for next year, but
for their contribution to covering things up and sticking platitudes on things without ever addressing the actual issues behind anything.
Love it.
I truly feel like toxic positivity is based on many people I know in real life.
Oh, look, there have been plenty of examples through my life of toxic positivity and just letting things blow over and saying, oh, it'll be all right.
Actually, I think I might have once been toxic positivity, because I can remember being the person who would just be like, you know, don't think about the things that bother you. Just think about the things that don't bother you, and you don't have to think about those bad things. Just think about the good things and it'll all work out.
Yeah.
How'd that work out?
Probably not as good as Pollyanna would have thought.
So now that we're at episode 30 in the series, and we did start with our vendetta against toxic positivity, because we've spoken to some amazing people along the way who shared both their professional experience and their lived experience. And there is a common thread through there of optimism and positivity and looking towards things working out. So I think it could be really easy to get confused between what's toxic positivity, or what we're calling that unhelpful toxic positivity, and what's actually really helpful, genuine optimism.
Yeah, what actually really helps to change the situation, because just slapping a platitude over it isn't going to do that. But there is a way to actually start to think differently about something and actually change the circumstances you're in.
So Leanne Carey, for example, our guest last episode, she's done some amazing groundbreaking work in the field of stroke rehabilitation. She had some incredible things to say about neuroplasticity and how the brain becomes more malleable and teachable after the trauma of stroke. But she also described herself as a positive thinker, and you know that causes the alarm bells for us. Ding, 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 ding.
I know, clang, clang.
Yeah. Could it be toxic positivity? But I don't think with Leanne it's toxic positivity at all.
No, I mean, Leanne's positive thinking isn't the toxic kind, because, you know, when we were exploring the value of leaning into possibility and instead of limitation in the last episode, we looked at Leanne's academic journey, and she explained to us how she had to actually fight back against some negative thinking in her field, because she was doing some really innovative stuff. You know, she's actually created an amazing program where people, they regain their senses, they regain the use of their physical limbs, and, you know, they're able to recover from the effects and impacts of stroke. And you don't get to that kind of point of being able to develop something to that magnitude that people previously thought was basically impossible without having some kind of optimism about you. You have to carry some kind of positive air about you to be able to go, no, I believe in this, and this is what I'm going to research, and this is what we're going to follow.
So I think it'd be really interesting to define that balance between I'm optimistic and I'm going to lean into a possibility that there is another way, versus I'm just going to stay positive even though...
Oh, yeah, just like an empty platitude.
Yeah, without the empty platitude. Yeah. Because if she'd just said, it's all going to work out fine, and it wouldn't if she didn't take a look at those other things underneath it and work with that and within people's conditions and physicality of where they actually are to move them to where they want to be.
Yeah, within all of that, there's evidence. So she had cause to be positive because she saw some clues that other people didn't. She had a hunch. she went on it and she moved on it and it worked out.
Now, we're not scientists, Andy.
No.
Although,
really?
we're also not therapists, but we have no problem giving out unqualified advice.
No. Well, look, we've got plenty of that to dole out.
I think we face the challenge throughout our lives of having to push through limitations ourselves.
Yeah, and there is that never-ending supply of positive infographics online. So, like climb the mountain and look at the view from above and...
Just do it.
Yeah, she'll be right, mate.
Now that we know that we're not the experts, but what we are is very good at finding experts to talk to, I think we should dedicate this episode to working out the differences between toxic positivity and optimism and find a bunch of people who can tell us more about it.
Yeah, well, someone we did call on was Dr. Tim Sharp, also known as Dr. Happy, and the founder of the Happiness Institute, and he helped us distinguish between toxic positivity and optimism.
I wanted to go back to the difference between being optimistic and toxic positivity, because I think that a lot of people don't make that distinction, and that you hear things like positive vibes only, just think positive, don't talk about the negative side of things. But I don't think that's helpful for people to move through things or for maintaining happiness.
Agree 100%. I guess it goes back to a similar comment I made earlier about being realistic. The reality is bad shit happens. The reality is there is negative stuff in the world. There's bad people and bad events, and things go wrong, and trying to pretend otherwise will, again, just lead to frustration and disappointment. I mean, if you pretend that everything is fantastic when it's not, it's just going to come and whack you over the back of the head. I spent a lot of time talking about this because it's very important. Optimism is undoubtedly something to aim towards, because we know for a fact that optimism is associated with not just more happiness, but better health, better quality relationships, greater longevity, etc., etc., etc. But when psychologists, when people like me talk about optimism, what we're talking about is something that's a bit different to quote unquote positive thinking. And the primary difference is it's grounded in realism. So for optimism to work, it's got to be realistic. If it's unrealistic, again, you just set yourself up for failure and you'll just be disappointed all the time. So there's nothing inherently wrong with positivity as long as it's grounded in reality.
How do you make that distinction as a person who wants to be optimistic? How do you know when you're just kind of lying about how you really feel about it?
Oh, look, I think we know, and I think we can just ask ourselves, just constantly check. Particularly if you're constantly feeling frustrated or disappointed in yourself or in others or in the world. If you constantly feel that you're not living up to what you want to or that others aren't, then there's a relatively good chance that your expectations are unrealistic. There might be other factors as well going on there. But again, if you're constantly frustrated and constantly disappointed, then just check your expectations. And if you can adjust them and reduce that frustration and disappointment, then obviously that will take away at least one of the causes of unhappiness.
Now, while Dr. Tim is an expert in happiness, Dr. Lisa Saulsman is the senior lecturer at the School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Western Australia, and she's an expert in the tools we can use to manage our thoughts, and her specialty is in cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT. And Lisa has authored several CBT self-help resources and also helped us to understand what CBT is.
Well, CBT, which stands for Cognitive Behaviour Therapy, that's kind of the long name, it really rests on a pretty simple idea, and that is that how we think largely determines how we feel. So really, our thoughts really drive our emotional, our physical, and our behavioural sorts of responses and reactions to things. So it's really about looking at how we see different situations, how we see the world, the meaning that we make of things, and how that determines what our experience is, whether that's a positive, helpful, pleasant experience, or whether that's perhaps an unpleasant, more negative experience for us. So it's all about the meaning that we bring to life, I think.
So I can see how people get confused, because how we think determines how we feel, and then those thoughts drive our responses and reactions to things. So if we only thought positive things, I suppose we'd only have a positive result. But toxic positivity doesn't take into account that we exist in a world that is influencing everything. And we have to look at working from where we are to get to where we want to be, because it's not just good vibes only.
No, and I think, there's also some theories and literature out there that kind of tell us that if we think something bad's going to happen, can be kind of misleading as well, because all of a sudden we start to fear those feelings that we quantify as bad.
Yeah. You want some trauma?
Go on. I know you've got some.
No, look, it's not too bad, actually. It is. The thing, I've been working with a psychologist now on my own mental health for, I think, about 3 years or so. And one of the things that I really, really struggled with before I started working with her on it is negative emotions. And it wasn't even it's a negative emotion and therefore I feel bad and that's bad. It was, I feel like for my entire life up until that lead up, I couldn't just feel a negative emotion. I had to condemn the negative emotion. So the secondary emotion that always came with that was guilt or anger or shame. If I felt sad, I couldn't just be sad. I was also angry that I was sad. I was mad at myself for being sad. I was disappointed. I was condemning my own negative emotions. And I think that that might have been toxic positivity.
It probably was, giving you a hiding for feeling bad about feeling bad.
I was feeling bad about feeling bad.
It's very meta of you.
What are you feeling bad about? I'm feeling bad about feeling bad. No, but what happened? I mean, I got angry, so now I'm mad that I'm angry.
And then I felt bad because I got angry.
And it sounds ridiculous, but I would...
When you look at it like that, yeah, but if you're living it...
I would get madder and I would get so down on myself about not... I had this idea before I ever medicated for depression and anxiety that I'm a smart person. I'm an intellectual person. I think I'm exceptionally smart. I think I get things really easily. I think that I could talk to you and offer you some great advice and listen to your situation and et cetera, and you'd probably come away from that feeling uplifted. And I've really struggled for a long time so why can't I do that for myself? Why can't I think myself out of this? If I feel this way, this negative way, I know that if you came to me and you were feeling negative, I'd be able to, in a conversation with you, hopefully talk you around to feeling a little bit better just through our interaction. I mean, you might not sustain it, but...
Some of our outtakes might say otherwise.
So why couldn't I do that for myself? I thought I should be able to think myself out of a negative place that I am. And so because I couldn't, I was failing. And that was the condemnation of those negative emotions.
Yeah. And also, I think it's important to say at this point as well that it's not always just about being able to talk yourself out of it as well, because, sometimes medication is completely the most valid option to help in the case of clinical depression, for example.
Yeah, medication 100%. It wasn't until I started taking medication that I realised just how silly I was for thinking that I could think my way out of it, because you can't think your way out of a chemical imbalance. You can't think your way out of dopamine deficiency.
No amount of positive thinking is going to think your way out of that. I was watching a video the other day, actually. Stella Young. Remember Stella Young? She did a TED talk, and the theme of toxic positivity came up, and she said, no matter how positive I think, no matter how much I'm sitting there and I think positively, it's not going to create a ramp where there's a staircase. And it's exactly that sort of thing you're talking about. If there's a chemical imbalance, you can think as positively as you like about it. It's still going to be there.
Still on my trauma, though. Do you have any trauma to add to this bit?
No, we'll wait to the next bit, I reckon.
Oh, you just wait for your trauma? Just a little bit more of my trauma?
Yeah. Wait till my Andy's interlude.
Andy's trauma interlude. So now that I have the benefit of hindsight on looking back at that judgy negative feelings, I can also see that how a lot of the actions and behaviours that I was doing was actually trying to avoid feeling things that were negative, trying to avoid situations that I might feel bad in. And that really doesn't play well when what you really want is to be authentic, because to really be authentic, you have to be vulnerable, and to put your vulnerability out there is a high possibility that it's going to be painful.
Yeah, and you've got to find a way to be able to process that and deal with those things, don't you? Because we can stuff it down, we can try and ignore it, we can try and give it to someone else even. Plenty of people do that. But in the end, it comes back to us bigger and better.
And I thought, if I think something negative, then I'm just going to get more negative things. I know
that's kind of like blaming yourself for it too, isn't it? That's beating yourself up again. Oh, I'm thinking negative. It's my fault. I'm going to create more negative stuff.
You know how I say that the world around us influences our mental health, and we can't separate the subjects. We don't exist in the vacuum. Our brain is not the only thing that there is. Our thoughts and feelings aren't the only thing that there is. There are other people's opinions. There are situations that we live. There's our body that we carry around with us. There's capitalism and colonialism and inequity and all of those things. I think that sometimes when I've been in some of the lower points of my life, the really depressive points, and I've thought things like I should be able to think my way out of this, and judge myself for those negative emotions. I don't even know if it's my own inner voice or if it's the voice of someone that I've picked up from a cultural, patriarchal, just existing for being human place. But suck it up, princess. What's moping around going to do? Big girls don't cry.
My question is, when you were considering that you should be able to think your way out of it, did you think about that optimistically or as a toxic positivity offering?
Well,
Are you be able to think your way out of this?
Hindsight is wonderful. And for every time that I said I could think my way out of it, for every list that I wrote where I said, you know what, if I just focus on the positive things, then it'll get better and I don't have to think about the negative things, the things that are bothering me or not working for me. If I write list after list of things that I'm grateful for, if I write, and this is not to shit on these things as a process, because they are useful, but genuinely now believe that it takes an acknowledgement of where you are and the world around you and an honest look at where you are.
Yeah, I mean, what list would have helped you with a chemical imbalance?
Well, I didn't know I had a chemical imbalance.
Exactly.
I sat there, in some of those darkest times of depression, so the first one that stands out to me is, I think we covered off, it's the one that we spoke about in the depression and anxiety episode, like episode 3, where it was one of those first suicidal ideation times where the act to follow wasn't that far off. And instead I ended up getting up off the floor of the shower and went for a drive and started to think, well, I'm not happy. What would make me happy? I remember the last time I was happy was when I worked in community radio and was doing that. And I thought, well, maybe I should do that again. I could do that as a career. And then I went away and wrote lists and goals and all the things that I was going to do to achieve that, and list after list after list and goal after goal after goal. But I never addressed what was underneath it, what that feeling was, that taking action, as beneficial as it was, because it got me off the floor of the shower, and it was certainly beneficial in that moment.
Absolutely.
I then went and built 20 years on top of those action points without actually addressing the why. I built lists of toxic positivity or a hopeful of future happiness, instead of allowing myself to, I don't even know the way to describe it, but it was a house of cards that was built on lists that had no genuine optimism.
They were just goals. They were empty goals.
They weren't empty goals. They were goals that I thought would bring me joy. And then along the journey in my lifetime, there's lots of things that have brought me joy. I don't know necessarily that actually obtaining any of the goals from my list were there. And as soon as you get a goal, then it's not enough and you need another goal.
There's always the next thing.
There's always another thing, because it's never addressing the underneath. And so to me, like that process of, I can write lists of all the things that are going well for me. I can write my gratitude journal. I can just focus on the good things. I can just stay positive, because even if it's not working out right now, all I have to do is just keep thinking positive and don't talk about the bad stuff. It'll work out. In all of that toxic positivity, there wasn't a genuine scrap of optimism. That's all hinged on a future happiness. It's the toxic positivity, that the platitudes are hinged on fake it till you make it. Maybe if I keep up this appearance, this lie to myself, and never look at what's underneath, eventually I'll be happy.
It's like that thing of, when I get this, then I'll feel that.
Yeah.
And always going for the next thing and never feeling that, but thinking the next thing might just be the thing that does it. Dr. Happy, Tim Sharp.
Yes.
Specialist in positive psychology. And, I know what some people might be thinking already, oh, here we go. But it's not about spraying the empty platitudes of toxic positivity around the place. He uses it in his therapeutic approach, and it's a therapeutic approach that shifts the focus from distress to flourishing, which he went into some detail with us about.
Well, it's interesting. There's always a bit of a debate about when positive psychology started. I guess officially, people often date it to around the 2000 or early 2000s when Martin Seligman was president of the American Psychological Association. He kind of formalized the discipline there. He said, what if we were to study what's well with people, if we were to study thriving and flourishing rather than just distress and dysfunction. So yes, it is about approximately 20 years old, but I guess it's also important to state and acknowledge all the people that went before that. And there were many people, many academics and researchers and clinicians who were focusing on similar issues, concepts like meaning and optimism and love and connection, and, that have been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, just not necessarily formalized in the structure that we now know as positive psychology. But anyway, if you put that debate aside, the primary difference is that, so my background was in clinical psychology, and as a clinical psychologist, we pretty much only focused on problems, on where people were going wrong, on faults and failings and weaknesses, and the idea was that if you could fix them, then that's the best you could do. And that's not completely inappropriate to fix mistakes or to correct faults in the way we're doing things. But I guess what positive psychology is saying is there's much more we can do. That's a good starting point. If we can help people overcome some of the obstacles in their lives, fix some of the mistakes they're making, reduce or eliminate distress and dysfunction, that's a good start. But positive psychology is saying, well, let's go much further and really promote thriving and flourishing and happiness and well-being. So that's probably that's the short answer.
So would it be more about trying to, rather than fix problems, to actually lead people into a place of modelling behaviour that supports their happiness more, and then that would diminish the things that aren't working so well? Or how does that fit into that whole scheme?
Yeah, definitely. Look, I think it's really important, or I believe it's really important anyway, not to see them as mutually exclusive, but as things that work together. Look, in all of my studies as a clinical psychologist, I did 3 degrees in psychology to become a clinical academic, and I don't think we discussed happiness once, which is bizarre. We didn't talk about happiness, we didn't talk about doing well, we didn't talk about love or success. It was all about misery, basically. And look, that's not totally inappropriate. Unfortunately, there is a lot of misery. We've all experienced the misery in our lives, depression, anxiety, whatever, and it is important. And clinical psychology, I say clinical psychology, but I mean, the broader mental, counselling and psychiatry as well, obviously. But, we've done a great job in recent decades to conduct the research and develop strategies to help people. So we can now help a lot of people who are suffering, and we can help them suffer less. But there really was a massive absence within all of that research and practice that didn't even consider the brighter side, the good things in life. And to come back to your question, I think the reason they're important is that, well, they're obviously important life. We can't live a good life without positive emotions like happiness. But what we also know is that focusing on some of those positive psychology principles can prevent some of the problems that people get into. So it's both a preventative and a booster, so it's like a double win in a way.
Bold statement. Toxic positivity teaches us we aren't worthy, do you think?
Yeah. Have you heard of the burnt chop syndrome?
I think I have, but explain it to me.
Well, the burnt chop syndrome, it's not really toxic positivity, but I think...
It's a toxic chop.
It's a toxic chop. Like it's when you kind of, the type of person who, if you're cooking dinner for your family and one of the chops is burnt, you'll give that chop to yourself. I've known people who don't give the chop to themselves, but I'm actually a burnt chop person. But they're also the sort of people that kind of go, oh, well, it's okay, brush it off. It doesn't really matter. Yeah, it's only a burnt chop. And sure, it's only a burnt chop, but maybe you could have half a burnt chop and someone else could have the other half of the good chop.
Oh, that's a good way of thinking about it, actually, because I was thinking about who I'd give the burnt chop to. And
yeah, right.
Not actually of sharing the burnt chop. I was thinking, do you know, sometimes when I've gotten really mad at ex-partners or whatever else, and I've thought that they were lazy and not very helpful, I have taken the best thing for myself and I've given them the crud left over. I'm like, if you're not going to cook your own fucking dinner, you can eat the shit part. But yes, we could have split the burnt chop, I suppose.
Could have split the burnt chop. I don't know where exactly I was going with that burnt chop. I was thinking of my mum, because she was the sort of person who, she taught me through life. She tried to teach me to be optimistic, but I think where I went with it was toxic positivity because I didn't quite understand, like you say, hindsight's a wonderful thing.
I bet your mum was a burnt chop person. She would have taken it for herself.
Jesus, she ate a lot of burnt. Well, no, she didn't eat a lot of burnt chops because she was actually a pretty good cook. But if there was a burnt chop, you can rest assured that Patty would have actually had the burnt chop. But, looking at her and how in some scenarios, there's a family member that would actually treat her quite badly and she wouldn't actually combat them. She wouldn't come back at them. And I think that's also where I get, my passive nature from as well, because, I was brought up, don't fight and don't get aggressive and all that sort of stuff, which are great things to actually bring your kids up to be.
Yeah, but there's a difference between, one punch can kill and don't stand up for yourself.
Yeah, and even those words that you just said then, stand up for yourself, to me that sounds like fighting words. So I kind of missed out on learning at that early stage of what it meant to actually advocate for yourself. So that's another way of saying it.
Yeah, that's a better way.
It doesn't involve any kind of physicality. It doesn't even involve any kind of verbal aggression. It just means being able to say, look, what you've just said, actually, I found quite hurtful. Or what you've said isn't true, and please don't say that sort of stuff about me. So I would observe her in situations where she was being verbally attacked by this family member, and she would just kind of put it down to, well, look, that's just how they are. It'll blow over. They'll be okay in a couple of hours. We'll just let it be. Toxic positivity.
Yeah.
It'll be okay. Don't worry about it. So like you were saying, it teaches us that we're not worthy, because she really should have been able to say to that relative, that's really unfair of you to say those things and I don't accept it. And I want you to never think about that, or whatever might have actually been a proper response for her to advocate for herself. But we get into these moments of powerlessness as well. And, sometimes if we haven't learnt those skills, because it takes courage to even say that.
Yeah, it does.
To someone who's launching in at you. And they know that. If they're being aggressive against you, they know that they're rattling you, and they'll feed off that sometimes because they're winning. They're winning the fight. No amount of toxic positivity is going to actually change how they behave in future.
It's not even just courage that it takes. It also takes energy.
Oh, yeah.
I think we're exhausted as a human race. I think we're exhausted. Your mum was probably just, do you know what? It's easier not to argue because I'm tired. I don't want to do that. It's easier not to rock the boat. It's easier just to pretend everything is okay.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely wanted to keep the peace and keep the status quo, because who knows, if something was said, then it might inflame things more, or things could get really out of hand. So yeah, we don't live in a vacuum. There's fear within that, and there is self-worth within that. So where we tend to land, unless we know better, is we just plaster it over with, I'll be okay. It'll be all right. Give it a couple of hours, or come back tomorrow and everything will be fine. And we just kind of let things ride.
It's like we got a shiny new pair of veneers on our teeth, but underneath they're rotting.
Yeah. They're going to fall out.
But it's okay because we got the shiny new ones on top.
And you were saying earlier about judging yourself for having negative emotions. But negative emotions exist, and they exist for a reason, because for me, they drive me to let me know when something isn't right for me. And that's not a bad thing. But I need to be able to sit with that and understand it and process it and find out what is right for me, instead of actually either getting inflamed and getting angry about it and then judging myself for getting angry, or doing the opposite thing and actually suppressing it and saying, oh, that's all right, gloss over it, it'll blow over. Sooner or later, if you want to start to experience legitimate positive emotions, you have to deal with the negative ones. You can't just let them stay hidden.
It's true. I think actually you've probably been braver than me for a long time to actually feel your emotions and let them sit with you and actually look at the negative emotions. That thought of mine that negative emotions are bad didn't come from nowhere.
No.
I picked it up from somewhere. Like, I bet it's really common. I wouldn't be surprised if your mum was afraid of what the negative emotions would mean. If it escalated a negative situation, what that would mean for the behaviour of other people, what that would mean for family dynamics, what it would mean for, if sometimes when you do advocate for yourself and somebody else doesn't want to hear it, you have to have strength of character to back yourself, because it can cause a rift, it can cause anger, it could cause a family separation or something like that.
I mean, we don't live in a Disney film. This isn't like a 3-act play where we have the point of crisis and then everything gets better and everybody's smiling and hugging at the end. Sometimes it does, but sometimes you end up with those rifts.
To advocate for herself at that point where she was being treated like that, it might have meant that that person removed themselves from her life, and maybe that emotion that she felt at the possibility that someone that she cared for, no matter how badly they treated her, would remove themselves, that she was afraid of that negative emotion, that she was afraid of what that would mean.
Afraid of the loss.
I think it's very brave that you've been able to look at that for as long as you have and make the decisions based on your own emotional health and not the response of other people.
Yeah. You know, I saw how it ate her up.
Yeah.
I saw how, you know, she was affected by some of that treatment and some of the comments that people would make and that sort of thing, and how, yeah, it's almost like she gave up. She confided in people, and she had great friends, and she would, you know, confide in them. And it's not the same, though, as being able to resolve it.
It's not.
Is it?
No, because
You know,
it does eat you up.
She still feels like shit in the end, you know, like, and, you know, like you say that I've been doing fine with sitting with stuff, and thank you. Like,
not necessarily fine, because it's not fine.
Oh,
it's not fine. It's not easy. But I mean,
no.
That you've been prepared to look at it. It takes enormous strength.
That's what I meant. Yeah. No, that's what I was getting at. Like acknowledging like that message, because like, I mean, you should read some of my fucking journals, man.
I've heard some of your journals.
You have heard some of my journals, and actually, even my therapist.
Mm-hmm.
I have a therapist. My therapist said to me the other day, because I've given her a couple of my entries to read, because she asked me if I could read them. I said, yeah. So I gave them to her. She said, actually, some people I say to try writing and to see if that actually helps, and you know, it doesn't really work for them, but you should write. But the thing is, like when I write, that's me sitting with those emotions. That's me actually honestly sitting there, pen to paper, going, this is what's running through my mind at the moment, and actually putting it out there. And nobody else has to read it. It's only me that sees it generally, unless I bring it to a podcast or take it to my therapist. But there's no pressure on myself to actually go and then state this to that person or do that, but it's me. It's my way of being able to actually just get those emotions onto a page, get those thoughts and feelings out onto the page, so I can actually see where I am. Because when I can see where I am, then I can do something about it. But if I bottle it up, it just keeps going.
How do you think you learned that? Because I didn't learn that. Where do you think you learned that as a skill, to actually be able to get those emotions out? Because my father was horrible at expressing his emotions, unless they were negative. Even to, you know, I think we've spoke about it before, but to the point where even before he died, he wouldn't tell me he loved me. And he said I was a disappointment, well, not a disappointment in those words, but he said I hadn't done enough, you know, like it was all of that. Like some of those things are cruel, but also I know that a lot of my trouble in expressing over my lifetime negative emotion is because I wasn't allowed to express negative emotion. I wasn't allowed to express positive emotion either. Like it didn't matter what the emotion was. It was going to get picked on.
No emotions, Louise. Stay flat.
Stay flat.
Hello, my name is Louise. Nice to meet you.
Look, and the thing is, I don't want to pin this all on, my parents, that's their fault, because he was a victim of his parents, and his parents were a victim of their parents, and it's a generational pattern, you know. Like
so you've got insight now too.
If I thought that he was closed off emotionally, and he 100% was closed off emotionally, then the thing that fucking opened my eyes to how he became how he was the day that I met his mother, whatever, she's not listening to the podcast. As I've learned more about his family background, I've seen how he thought he was doing better than the model that he had, and he was doing better than the model that he had. It's just that it wasn't good enough for me.
Yeah.
But he was just as much of a victim of a shitty, unemotional model as I was, but in a different way. And then I wouldn't be surprised if it goes back more generations than that. So if you were in not that same situation, but I, got to 39, 30, 40 almost before I could even acknowledge that my negative emotions weren't a bad thing, that I could even actually let myself feel emotions without shutting them down, whether they were negative or positive. I've tended to curb them either side because we don't show emotions around here. Your situation's not that different from mine. So where did you pick up the ability to put it out there and actually sit with it? Because it's not something that we learn. It's not something we were taught. And I don't think it's something that we innately know.
No, it's not. I have to say that when I actually started the journaling, I don't know if I was actually really sitting with the emotions. I was actually just getting them out on the page, because I knew that to help clear my mind, that, when Dad died and all the shit went down, I would take myself away and I would write. Sometimes it would be poetry. Sometimes it would just be prose. Sometimes it was completely illegible. But whatever I was writing, I was actually just getting whatever was running through my mind onto that page. And if it was on the page, it wasn't in my head. So I probably wasn't sitting with it at that point. So as we started talking to people like Kimberly Norris, way back in, that was episode 3, and talking about this concept of sitting with things, and I really kind of then just started to think, okay, well, if I'm writing this stuff, pay attention to what you're writing. I'd then start to not only write about it, but pause and think about it and think about how it could be different.
Well, I know that that's something fairly recent with Kimberly Norris in the last 18 months or so, but I think you were doing it before then. I think you were writing, like it sounds like you were writing honestly your emotions. When I used to journal, I think I was still lying. even in my journals. I think I was still lying.
You use coded language so that if anyone did read it, they wouldn't really know what was going on.
Not even coded, just I think I was lying to myself about how I felt about things.
So what you're saying is you were writing these journals and you're going, today was a fucking great day. It was better than yesterday, but it was actually shit.
I mean,
it was actually complete shit.
It's not that far from the truth, though, is it? It's kind of.
I mean, my early journals, I'm calling people fucking cunts in my journals.
You
fucking cunt did this and fucking cunt said that. I know. I was angry.
I turned that anger inward.
I was fucking angry. Yeah, I used to. And I got ticked off for saying some things that I probably shouldn't have said around that time.
Is this in your early journals or?
Where else does that anger go? This is in like when I was actually still like in Sydney around the time of Dad's funeral, because I was journaling and I was getting a great deal of that anger onto the page, but I was still angry. I was so angry. Where else does that anger go? Especially if you feel like you're getting shut down, it just goes woof and up it comes. And, that's the point you don't want to get to. The point we want to be at is being able to have conversations with people early and actually resolve things. We don't want to get to the point of such anger that it annihilates relationships.
Seeing we're deep diving into some trauma here, which wasn't planned in the script.
Wasn't planned.
Well, this wasn't planned. These stories weren't planned. They're completely off the cuff. I realised that in the work that I've been doing recently, for most of my life, every time I was feeling negative emotions, whether they were sadness or I was mad or grief or whatever it was, it kind of just hit an overwhelm for me and I dissociated from it. So it's like something flicked in my brain and just said, no, it's just too much. It's too hard. I'm just going to turn that off right now. And not in a creepy horror movie, someone dissociates and then goes and murders you kind of way, but just as I think it's like as a protective mechanism. That's just my brain, my body just went, this emotion is overwhelming. Let's just not feel that anymore and instead just feel kind of muted or numb to it. And it works the other way as well, where I think I've held myself back from feeling, extreme joy, a lot of those higher emotions as well, because they've also been overwhelming at times.
Also, we're kind of mistaught around the concept of resilience as well. I think for a long time I thought resilience was about saying to myself, it's okay, pick yourself up and move on.
Yeah.
It'll be okay.
Yeah.
And it's not that.
No.
It's not that. It's toxic positivity.
Keep pushing through. Just keep going. That piece of paper that I remember being on the back of the door at the Cambridge Curves gym in fucking 2003 or whatever it was, and it was
on the back of the toilet door.
It was on the back of the toilet door. It was the motivational poster on the back of the toilet door, and it was something like commitment is making a promise to do it no matter what. And different series we could go into, but gym positivity, I can remember at a time then hating my body so much that I literally sprained my ankle at one point there, and I was still going to the gym every day and all I was eating was watermelon and like nothing else, and spending 3 hours on the rowing machine pushing through an ankle injury because commitment means doing it no matter what.
Yeah. Wow.
When you say that's what resilience felt like, that is what resilience felt like. It meant that pushing through. Whatever the cost. But that's toxic.
Yeah, it is toxic. So a little way back now, we met mindset coach Teisha Rose, who is an amazing lady. And she's someone who has had her own life interrupted twice now by major illness. You know, when she was 22, she was diagnosed with MS. And more recently, she was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. And she's got her own views on toxic positivity.
I think when people do the thing that we are calling toxic positivity, when they say, oh, just don't think about it, or you could feel differently, you don't have to change anything, I don't think that they take into account chronic illnesses that get your attention because you can't escape your own body. So how do you deal with changing your mindset when your body is working against you?
I think I've learned to focus on what I can do as opposed to really lamenting what I can no longer do. For me, even when I was really, I don't like the word dysfunctional, but, you know, I was really immobile. I was really unable to walk and at the beginning I was like, oh, that's not fair. You know, I can't walk. But then I was getting excited because I could wriggle a toe or I could move a foot. So I think it's very much not accepting where my body was because, gosh, I work so hard in rehab and I do so much now. Like I have a neurophysio come to the house every 2 weeks. I go to osteo. I do so much to maximise the functioning that I have. So yeah, I'm certainly focused on what I can do and try and keep on improving that. Yeah, so it is hard though. Like when you do have limitations in your body, you're constantly reminded of what you can't do, but you really got to try and shift your focus onto what you can do.
One of the things I kind of wanted to go back to when you mentioned that when we talk about the idea of moving through, like you don't really move through MS, you don't get to the finish line and then suddenly it's all okay, like it can come back. And I think of how that relates to my experience with like depressive episodes. As much as I'd like to say that, you know, today on my score chart, I'm only mildly depressed and that's a win, I've noticed that over, you know, the course of my life, they come back again and again, triggered by whatever it might be. I suppose it's like I'm never actually cured of that, because if I don't do the work every day to try and keep on top of something like that, then my thoughts will get out of control and things will happen, and there's not an end goal to any of those situations that we're living in.
No, that's right. And that's the same with so many experiences people have. And you do have to keep working on yourself, and you do have to apply then what you've learnt in previous episodes or, you know, periods of poor health to what you're experiencing now, and you get better at it. I guess if you sort of want to as well. So if you do the hard work, I know, you know, chatting to my physio, she said some people get really annoyed that because of their illness, they have to do so much work to getting their body up and right. Whereas I think, well, that's just part of it. Like I'm just grateful that she comes around and can help me. So it's all of that work that you do, but the outcome of that is a positive one because you're better equipped to deal with whatever challenge. And I think too, like having gone through something like MS, it equips you to deal with any challenges that come your way. And MS is not the only thing you have to deal with in life. You know, something's always going to come across our paths, and at least I'm better equipped to deal with that.
I think often we look for a magic bullet or a magic pill that's going to make everything better or everything go away. Do you think that there is something within each of us that's different that we can find that strength and motivation in?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting, everyone's experience with MS is very different, but that's because we've all been very different in our outlooks in life before being diagnosed. So I think, you know, you really need to build on the strengths you display in all aspects of your life and then apply those and remind yourself of those when you're dealing with something. So build on those strengths. I really think it's important when working with people to highlight those strengths, and those strengths don't abandon you when you're faced with something like a long stay in hospital, but you need to call on them to help you out, to learn from what you're going through and learn what works for you.
I wish there was a magic pill though, hey?
Yeah. I mean, there are some pretty magic pills out there. But
where's my panacea?
Not going to get you where you actually need to go.
It's like that, seeing we're doing some fat girl trauma today. It's the... It's the 11-year-old who used to say a prayer every night before she went to bed that she'd wake up thin tomorrow. and then God never delivered.
Bitch. Maybe the wish is still coming. If there were so many wishes, maybe it's still coming.
Well,
you wake up tomorrow and poof, gone.
They've got much further to go now than they did when I was 11. I'll tell you that. So good luck to disappearing a whole other person overnight. I could lean into possibility though. It is possible.
Yeah, but is that important to you?
Not anymore. No.
It's a whole other rabbit hole we could go down with.
Well, fat girl trauma is an old story, so that's past. Why don't we move on to, more recent trauma then, like some of the stuff that we've experienced in the series.
And also, some of the insights from our guests, because with every story that we've heard and, the stories that we've been telling along the way, there is a turning point, isn't there? People have their stories. And, I said earlier, like we're not in a Disney film. Whether you've cut that out or not, I don't know.
No. We're still not in a Disney film. And if we were, it would be that Zootopia porn subreddit I found the other day. I'll send it to you later.
Got to try everything. Anyway, there is a turning point in
I'm leaving that in
stories. The turning point, is where people kind of have that. I guess it's an aha moment. I've heard it described as before. Where they go, okay, this is actually what I've got to do. This is what it's going to take. Yeah, a couple of episodes back, we spoke to Lucy Bloom, and she was telling us about when she was in hospital after an accident, and she didn't know what the outcome was going to be with her foot, with her leg. Didn't know whether it was going to be amputated, didn't know whether she was going to be fine or somewhere in between. And she said that she fantasized about what could go right instead, because at that point she had just as much control over that as whatever could have happened in the opposite direction.
And that's something that could sound like toxic positivity.
It could, but it wasn't. We asked her, how this differed to toxic positivity. How do you feel about some of these affirmations that are kind of getting around? Don't worry, be happy, all that kind of stuff. It's stuff that just kind of doesn't hit the mark.
Yeah, it's floppy, isn't it? I'm an optimistic person because it feels better. I make lots of choices because it feels better rolling around in this body of mine. So I choose things because they're fun, for example, rather than super serious stuff. But you're right about toxic positivity being just like sort of surface. It's a bit like peanut butter on top when there's actually jelly underneath it. I prefer to be optimistic, and my philosophy in life is to just keep moving forward, especially when things are really, really tough. So some really tough things have happened to me in my life, and the only way I can see through them is to just keep moving forward. And what that forward looks like is different for everyone. So for me, it might be reinventing myself, changing my career. I got fired, bam, I changed my career then. My marriage ends, okay, I've got a whole new next decade where I'm not living in a nuclear family like I thought I would for the rest of my life. I get to reframe my whole life. I see that as an opportunity. I have some time to grieve it, but then you can only move forward. So I'm not a fan of toxic masculinity either. Toxic positivity.
Same.
I'm not a fan of that, and it might be cute on a t-shirt, but it actually doesn't soothe anyone, and I think it tries to but doesn't work. The best way to soothe someone like me, because we're all different, is to acknowledge that something is shit and then help that person keep moving forward. Just keep moving along, little steps, keep moving forward.
Psst. I'm just going to do a little circuit breaker here and say thank you for listening to us. If you love the show, let us know. Hit the subscribe button on your podcast app and show us those 5-star ratings. Remember to tell your friends about us and check our Patreon page for access to even more content, like extended interviews at patreon.com/reframe of mind. The more people we get talking about mental health, the more supported we'll all be.
Another one of our guests who has moved mountains before is Professor Maree Teesson. She's an
Maree is so cool. Love Maree. Hi, Maree.
Hi, Maree. She's an expert on mental health. She's the director of the Matilda Centre for Research in Mental Health and Substance Use. And now we don't want to say we necessarily tasked her with her next research brief, but she did
We'd never make that claim.
She did love when we coined that term toxic positivity as a description for empty positivity that masquerades as optimism.
I really love that term, toxic positivity.
We'll get it printed on a t-shirt.
Wow. I think let's chuck out toxic positivity and toxic negativity and let's talk about greater compassion. So it's being self-compassion and compassion to others. So I do love that toxic positivity. It makes me want to throw it out, but it's definitely toxic positivity.
I think we've found the subject of your next research paper.
I know, exactly. I'm a very positive person. You probably hear this, but compassion first, being a human, understanding that we're human, that comes first. Yep. Should is an incredibly powerful one to work with. Just challenging that normative stuff. Everyone's doing it. Maybe it isn't everyone. That's an incredibly powerful one too. I even practice making sure I don't say should.
Yeah.
And that's
Shouldn't say should.
Yeah, that's right. Banned. It's completely banned. And I use that in all sorts of aspects of my life. So I 100% agree. These are amazing skills that you can have and that you can transfer across so many different areas. Unlike that little word should is so powerful because it's so laden in guilt and expectations. So I think really it's not underestimating the power that one word can have in our lives and the way that we can change the way we interact with the world by reflecting on that and by just making a small change, what seems like a small change, but I think you've both picked up where it can snowball into being a really large positive change.
Noticed it in things like, particularly, I suppose, in forecasting stuff, I should have this done or I should have this figured out by now. And who's really putting these arbitrary rules on things? Because it's just adding anxiety to the pile that didn't need to be added.
Yeah. And I should feel this way or I should feel that way. And again, like you said, it's adding the anxiety onto that pile and you really don't need to add any more anxiety onto that pile. And expectations on ourselves, like we are in control. We can actually set the rules and we can set the timeline. And to allow other people to do that can just really increase that anxiety.
What are you replacing your shoulds with when you hear them?
Oh, it depends on what the area is that I'm saying should in. A big one for me is, I should finish my work a lot faster than I am finishing it. And the reality is that I'm finishing in the time that I am finishing it. There are factors that are associated with that. I may like to do it slightly faster or in a different way. And I can then, by chucking away should, think about, well, what are the things that stop me from doing it in the way that I wanted to do it? Another strategy I use is not I should finish the work, but what are some of the positive things about finishing earlier? What are some of the less positive things about finishing earlier? And how can I get to those? So chucking away should allows me to pull the issue apart a little bit more and to reflect that, okay, I might be doing it slower, but I'm still getting it done. So it allows the positive in.
You called me Pollyanna before. Rude.
I know. Well, we're all familiar with that term, Pollyanna.
I don't know if we are. This is borderline of one of Auntie's old references because I did not read Pollyanna growing up. No one knows Pollyanna.
I didn't read Pollyanna growing up either, but I've heard it used plenty of times to describe someone who's naive or who's got that excessive optimism that everything's just going to be fine tomorrow. Different character, but you get the idea.
I think it might have came in the same book club as Black Beauty.
It might even have been earlier than Black Beauty, but it's a term that's thrown around for people who are just overly optimistic, who just think that everything's just going to be fine and there's nothing wrong here, nothing to see here, everything's good. Pollyanna.
So how do we avoid being Pollyanna or being naive with excessive optimism that isn't actually real when we're reframing our mind? Lisa Saulsman explains.
I wonder how we can approach that without bringing ourselves into a situation where we can be accused of being Pollyanna, where sometimes we try to reframe and get a different perspective, but people say, well, you're just ignoring the facts. You're in denial.
Yeah, well, I think in CBT it is very much about balanced thinking, more kind of realistic thinking. And it's not that everything is wonderful and everything is rosy and there aren't things that we can work on ourselves, but it is about trying to bring a more helpful perspective to different things that we might have been through or might be predicting we're going to go through. So if it's all just positive and not realistic, we're probably not going to believe it. So that's another element to it. The sorts of thinking, we're trying to move to more helpful perspectives and helpful ways of thinking, but we want it to be helpful and reasonable logical and realistic and balanced, and therefore believable. Because if you don't believe it, it's probably not going to make much of an impact on you emotionally. It's just going to be a bunch of words you're telling yourself that doesn't really have much conviction or traction.
We've had this conversation between ourselves around toxic positivity and how sometimes we see memes on social media which really conflate a lot of ideas that aren't discussed in arriving at that particular kind of conclusion. Is there more value in us being able to unpack those, do you think? I mean, often we'll see things on social media where people talk about, I'm feeling super inspired today and I'm just going to go and smash everything. And that sounds just like an empty affirmation.
Yeah. And I think for me, it's not that one way of thinking is right and one way of thinking is wrong. I think you really need to look at the individual and what the consequences are of adopting that attitude. And maybe for one individual, maybe that's really helpful and it does lead to them being motivated and getting things done or what have you. And maybe for another individual, that's really not a helpful way to go and it's just sort of empty words that don't really lead anywhere particularly productive. So I think with CBT, it's not that there's a right way to think, there's just different ways to think, different perspectives we can bring. And it's really about starting to find for the individual what works for them in helping them, I guess, lead a life that's very in tune with kind of their goals and their values and what they want to get out of life. And it's helping them live, I guess, a good quality of life, really. So I always like to look at kind of not what is it that the person's doing with their thinking, but what's the consequences to them and is that helping them or not helping them?
I wonder if also there is the possibility that we can overthink in the positive sense and fall into the trap of daydreaming and not taking action.
Well, yeah, and I think most of the time I'm often working with excessive, repetitive, negative thinking, but I think you're absolutely right. I think any thinking that's excessive, you can be excessive over planning or absolutely you're getting caught in daydreams and that kind of inhibiting taking action. I think we can get very caught in our thoughts. And again, it is about, for me, looking at the consequences when someone's engaging in excessive positive thinking. Well, what's the outcome of that for that person? Is it a helpful outcome or is it not? Is it inhibiting them from doing the things they need to be doing? So again, it's the excessive nature of the thinking and what does that lead to for that person? How does that bog them down? How does that paralyze them from the doing? And I guess from the things that we want or need or would like to be doing in life, how is the thinking getting in the way, regardless of whether that's positive thinking or negative thinking or neutral thinking? There's just lots of thinking going on and is that inhibiting them in some way?
Yeah, it kind of struck us while we were having these conversations throughout the series that we seem to be in like a constant pursuit of happiness.
Not like the Will Smith movie.
Oh, I don't know. It's like we're all chasing some ideal that's been used. You know? Go on.
I'm just going to shit.
I know you're busting to go.
I'm busting to shit on it. It's just because it's called The Pursuit of Happiness, but there's literally nothing that he does in that movie that's happy.
Because he's pursuing it. That's just the thing. Like,
and then he gets to the end and then what? Then he put up with a really shitty journey to get this job.
Yeah. Oh, I think I remember seeing that. Yeah.
Yeah, this one where with his kid and then they have to, with the real Jaden, and then he tries to sell those machines and then he ends up homeless and he loses all his money and then they end up in the shelter and then he's got no money for anything and he's working all these things and he goes and he gets that job and it's like 2 hours of hard fucking slog and then they have the nerve to call it The Pursuit of Happiness when he's done nothing happy the whole movie.
Interesting though, because like with the Bill of Rights in the American, like the Declaration of Independence, it gives people the right to pursue happiness. It doesn't give them the right to happiness.
You can't obtain it. You can just try for it.
All you like. You'll probably never get it, but you can pursue it.
Oh, they knew what they were doing when they set that up. Do you think we have to be happy all the time though? I mean, Will Smith could have done with being a little happy somewhere in that movie called Happiness.
There must have been some happy moments. You must have felt some kind of
No. You go back and rewatch it. It's not happy. I don't even think the ending's that happy. Not after that long a slog. I was happy it was over.
It was probably a comment on that exact point about the pursuit of happiness and never getting it.
Oh, and I never got it.
Maybe. But, I don't think that we have to be happy all the time. And I don't even think that it's kind of, I don't know, it's one of those things that we're told in these platitudes and all of this toxic positivity that we see online or even here with people we speak to or on TV or radio or whatever. There's this push for us to be happy. But there's got to be some other emotion out there, right? That's not sadness. Like just because we're not happy doesn't mean that we're sad, right? There's got to be something else.
Well,
It doesn't have to be negative.
more on this from Dr. Happy, Tim Sharp.
You talk of happiness being just one type of positive emotion, and I wonder if in constantly pursuing happiness, whether we're actually disregarding or downplaying some of those other great positive emotions that we don't tend to focus on and possibly are missing out on.
Yeah, sometimes. I must admit I've had this sort of a bit of a love-hate relationship with the name that I came up with, the Happiness Institute. I do like it. It's catchy. It gets people's attention. And, it's a nice sort of simple brand, I suppose. But you're 100% right. And so I spend a lot of my time busting a lot of the myths associated with that and trying to encourage people to understand that, yes, happiness is just one of many positive emotions. The others are just as, if not more, they're all important. And in addition to happiness, there's joy and calm and contentment and satisfaction and pride. And the other bit that I also talk a lot about, which is just as, if not more important, is that the so-called negative emotions are important as well. And this is, again, one of the myths that I spend lots of time busting, that just because I focus on happiness, just because I encourage people to work towards positivity, which really is important, these things are really important, doesn't mean, no one will be happy every minute of every day. We shouldn't try to be. It's an unrealistic expectation. You'll just get disappointed and frustrated. And those so-called negative emotions are important. They're important parts of being human. I mean, we wouldn't have survived as a species without fear and anxiety. We wouldn't be humans connected to other humans without sadness and grief. So it's a really important message that I do spend a lot of time talking about, is that we shouldn't dismiss or try to deny the reality of all of those emotions. That's what being a human is, experiencing all of those, accepting all of those. Certainly we want to try to manage some of those unpleasant ones because they are unpleasant, and there are things we can do to minimize them or manage them or accept them. And we do want to maximize the positive ones because they're good for us. They provide a whole bunch of benefits. But it really is about getting that balance right. And that will vary from person to person, and even for the same person at different times of their life.
Is there also a range of neutrality within that? I wonder, if it's possible for us to go through some days not feeling any kind of extreme of happiness or sadness, but just feeling content, and that is actually neither happy nor sad.
Well, technically, contentment is considered a positive emotion. I mean, if you were talking to, if I put my academic hat on, contentment is it's a pleasurable feeling. So it is a positive emotion. I guess one way to think about it is we can divide those emotions, both the positive and the negative ones, into high versus low arousal. So when most people think about happiness, they think about it in the high arousal form, which is things like joy and excitement. But what they often do is they sort of overemphasize or exaggerate the importance of those ones and underemphasize the importance of some of the low arousal ones like calm or contentment, which is a pity because, as you've quite rightly said, those things are just as important, and in fact they're really important parts of our lives, and arguably some people would say they're more important over the longer term, because by definition the high arousal ones tend to be fleeting and short-lived, which doesn't mean they're not good. They're still good for us, but they can come and go sometimes within seconds or within minutes or whatever. Whereas if we're thinking long term, and this is really what positive psychology is about, it's not just those minute-to-minute emotions, but it's about living our best life, which is obviously hopefully a long-term thing if we're going to live a long life. And if we're going to thrive and flourish, then those longer-term, sort of more enduring, deeper emotions like contentment and satisfaction are really, really important.
Dr. Happy's allowed to talk about arousal, but I get in trouble for Zootopia porn references.
I think he's talking about another kind of arousal. Just quietly.
Much like that subreddit, negative feelings are uncomfortable for me. I mean, they probably are for everyone, actually.
Probably.
Back to suck it up, princess. Those beliefs that I had, I really have lived my whole life feeling don't show feelings. It only hurts if you allow the yucky feelings. It doesn't hurt if you don't allow them. And letting go of that need to judge the feelings and instead understanding that they're just feedback that I can use to reframe my mind, that I can use as guidance on how I feel about particular things or situations, that they're really feedback.
It's a big one, isn't it?
Yeah. I think I briefly touched on it last episode, that feeling towards the end of one of my depressive episodes, my depressive periods. And they were, as Dr. Happy would say, clinical chronic depressive episodes. It wasn't a bad mood. It was a sustained period of time. And as you start to come out of those sustained periods of time, but because you're not that far away from where you were, like for me, I was so scared of slipping back into the depressive place, because, you know, it's not like one day the depression ends, you get off the ride, the ticket's over. It's
magic fog lifts and everyone's happy.
I took the magic pill. I prayed to not be fat and I woke up thin the next day. It doesn't. I prayed to not be depressed and I woke up happy the next day. It doesn't happen either. And so I'm feeling more confident about it now. A number of months have passed by, but I think for a few months at least, once I started to get medicated, seek therapy, make changes in my life, work through those feelings, allow myself to feel those things, I was afraid of sliding back into it and spiraling back down. And I thought, if I allow myself to feel negative feelings, then that's the gateway path to, we're back down to depression town. And I actually think that statement has been true for my entire life, because it's not just the last period of clinical depression. I can probably count at least 5 periods of clinical depression in my lifetime, whether they were diagnosed or not to the same extent. And they've always been places that I've been afraid to be. I'm very much afraid of sliding back down there. So sometimes that toxic positivity of, you know, let's make the lists of the things that we're grateful for and it's going to be okay no matter what. Don't think about the bad things. Don't feel the bad things, has been because if we think of those things, then off we go on the slippery dip back down to depression town.
It's such a steep and slippery slope, isn't it? It's just, poof, you're there. It doesn't take much.
But all of that was through the eyes of somebody who wasn't seeing negative emotion as feedback. That was through the eyes of someone who was seeing negative emotion as something to be avoided, that was judging that negative emotion that they felt as well. Because I think once I got that idea that it could be feedback, and much like all other feedback, it's just another tool that's in our arsenal that we can use. It doesn't have to be paralyzing.
No, it doesn't. And I think, you know, when we were talking earlier about how I sit with my journal and how I've got all of those things on the page, I don't feel paralyzed by them. I feel like I'm liberating myself from them when I'm getting them down there. And I feel like that, okay, I've named it now. I've put it there. I've called it something. And I can see it, and I'm saying that I can see it. Now I can do something with it.
Yeah, I think there's immense power in giving it a name. It gets it out of your head. It makes it tangible so that, I don't know, it becomes something that you can work on. It's not so scary when you give it a name.
And it can stop it from going around and round and round in your head as well.
Oh, you mean on my loops, my anxiety loops?
You know, but I've had those too. And when I journal, the loop stops. It's a bang. It's out on the page. I'm doing something with it now. And so you talk about your anxiety loops, and I've had them as well in the past. You know, I've had times where I've had really, really persistent thoughts, things that just would not let up. And what I would do with those thoughts is, in some way, I'd hurt myself with them, obviously, because I'd make myself feel sad or angry or whatever, and push it down, and they'd still go. They'd still be there.
This idea of suck it up, princess. I don't know why I love that phrase so much. Maybe it's because I heard it so many times growing up.
Saw it on a subreddit.
No. That might be a mantra for my whole life up until recently. Suck it up, suck it down, suck it up. Feels bad. Suck it in. Oh my God, it's the Suck It 3000.
There you go. Hey?
We were ahead of the time with that sketch.
Suck it.
You know, like I feel like I was sucking up my life with you know, things I didn't like in my career. Suck it up. Relationships I didn't like. Suck it up.
Just suck it up. Just suck it up and move on.
Not living authentically. Suck it up. Just suck it all up. This is how I knew that didn't work very well, is I ended up in the hospital, actually twice. One time I had chest pains for 3 days and thought, it'll be fine. It's nothing. It's probably just anxiety. And then it was just anxiety, but still not a great story. Go get chest pains looked at.
Yes. Please do. If you have chest pains, go to the hospital. Stop listening and go to the hospital. But
this one I'm thinking of, I actually had in my neck, I had this really hard lump in my throat. And I was like, what is that? Like if you put your hand right on kind of that larynxy area at the front of your throat, it was really like rock hard for me. And I was starting to feel like I couldn't breathe and I couldn't swallow. And it was causing that, well, it wasn't causing, it was part of that anxiety that when those kind of physical things happen to me, I feel like then the next step is the meltdown, is the anxiety attack. So I actually went to the hospital with it. And when I saw the doctor, he said, "Are you feeling anxiety?" I mean, no shit, Sherlock, right? I said, yeah. And he's like, "Well, I think this is called a globus pharyngeus."
Oh.
Yes.
A globus pharyngeus. Stunning sample.
I don't even know if that's how it's said, to be honest. A globus pharyngeus, which
it is now,
is apparently, it is a literal manifestation of anxiety that sits in your neck. So it makes your glands pop out and harden up. It hardened up, princess, in my throat. And because I was like, oh my God, what is it, a tumour? Is it my thyroid? What could it be?
A lump in the throat's not a good sign.
He said, "It's your global pharyngeus. I think it's anxiety related." And here's how I know he was right. It's because when he said it's anxiety related, I instantly felt the tension ease and I could breathe again.
Wow. So you released your anxiety about what this lump in the throat was, and it was a self-referential globus pharyngeus.
It was, and it was a self-referential metaphor as well for feeling like I couldn't express myself in my day-to-day life. So I manifested an anxiety lump in my face, in my neck, that literally made me feel like I couldn't breathe. And then as I was able to sit with it and say, oh, okay, well, that sounds right. He's like, try breathing and try breathing. Everyone says, you got anxiety, breathe. I am fucking breathing. I am fucking breathing. It doesn't change the rest of my life. And he's right. It went away after a couple of days. It completely released out of there. And just knowing that it was an actual, and until that point I didn't know that anxiety could manifest physically in the body in that way, but to know that, it made it ease. It felt like relief.
Yeah, amazing.
So maybe that's why good vibes only sucks, because bad vibes can be necessary messages, and ignoring them land you in medical situations driven by anxiety and in hospital with suspected heart attacks. Good vibes only.
Yeah. If
Not
you don't
so
deal
good.
with it, you're going to end up in a hospital bed. When I've been anxious in the past, I talked about those persistent thoughts, So what do you do when those thoughts just keep persisting? And like I've said, for me, it's useful to write things out. It might not be useful for somebody else though. Like I said earlier, my therapist said to me recently when she read a journal entry of mine, "I don't recommend this for everybody, but you should keep doing it because it works for you." And it does. I feel like it does. Also, we're talking about talk therapy here as well. So there are medical conditions that exist where persistent thoughts are actually a part of that as well. And that's a completely different thing. We're not here to offer any form of diagnosis. We're just kind of looking for ways to give ourselves the mental space to create change. So this is stuff that's worked for me specifically. It might not be anywhere near the same for anybody else because we're all different. And we all have our own things going on. Having said that, though, this is valid stuff that we're talking about, because other things out of the equation, when you give mental space to yourself to create positive change, then positive change can happen.
And Lisa Saulsman, our cognitive behavioural therapist, had some great techniques to teach us about postponing our thoughts.
What's the best way out of that forest and into the pathway of doing?
Kind of a big strategy I often work on with lots of people that I see is the idea of trying to postpone their thoughts. Kind of sounds like an unusual concept, but the idea of recognizing when we are getting caught in our thoughts, whatever they might be, and actually sort of intentionally making the decision to postpone that for now, to come back to that at a later time, to delay thinking more about that. So it's not a problem that whatever it is, whatever thoughts popped up, that's not an issue, but to be able to step out of chasing that thought and getting into that excessive thinking, and postponement can be a helpful way of doing that, because typically what people do when they have a negative thought perhaps pop into their mind is they often do one of two things. They either pull the thought really close, they do lots more thinking on it, and often what can be driving that is that they think they're going to get something out of that. By giving this worry, for example, more thought, I might fix the problem, I might understand the problem, I might be better prepared for things or preempt things, or there can be lots of different reasons, but it's the idea I'll get value out of giving things more thought. So they pull the thoughts closer. That's kind of how I refer to it. And it makes a lot of sense that we do that. You think of our education, if there's a problem, just think lots more about it. That's kind of what we've kind of been used to. So that's one thing. We pull the thoughts closer and we do lots more thinking on whatever that worry might be. The alternative is that sometimes we realise that it's not helping us or it's not good for us to be getting so bogged down in the negative thoughts, and then we try and push them away. We try and suppress our thoughts. And what we know happens when we try and suppress our thoughts is they just come back with more fury. Thought suppression really doesn't work. You just get more of that thinking. So what can often happen when people are getting caught in their thoughts is they're getting caught in this tussle of pulling the thoughts closer because they think they're going to get something out of doing lots of thinking, and then at the same time sort of pushing them away because they know it's not good for them. And they're caught in this push-pull kind of tug-of-war almost. So postponement is kind of doing something completely different. It's putting the thoughts to the side for a later time. And what I do find happens when people have a go at doing this, bringing this into their own lives and having a go at it, is often people come back and say, gee, lots of the things that seemed important, seemed like burning thoughts I needed to think about, later on when I looked at them, most of them were kind of really irrelevant. I really didn't need to think about them. They were not really important. So I guess a big thing I often work with people on is that later is always when we do our best thinking. I don't think any of us do our best thinking in the moment when a negative thought or worry or whatever is popped into our head and it seems like it's really important. I think we all do our best thinking later, coming back to something later with fresh eyes, having a much different perspective about whether that thing actually is important, whether it is worth thinking about. And then if it is, for the subset of things that are, I think we come back with fresh eyes about how to think about it in a more productive sort of a way, a more helpful way, rather than just like a repetitive overthinking, over-analysis sort of a way that gets us bogged down.
I wonder how this it connects to kind of procrastination as well. If I can share a quick story from me this week, is there was a thing that happened that I felt worried about not having an answer to. And even though I could have taken an action of making a phone call and getting an answer, instead I chose to spend 3 days deciding whether or not to take a phone call and get an answer to the thing that was worrying me.
Yeah.
And then when I made the phone call, because Andy said, you could have just made the phone call by now, after 3 days of procrastinating on whether to make a phone call, it was easy. So it's
a nice example. I think that's a nice example of our overthinking really bogging us down and paralysing us from taking action. And so something I often will say, I'll be very clear about, is we're talking about postponing unhelpful thinking. We're not talking about postponing action. So it's about postponing and stepping out of those thoughts that bog us down, but taking action where we need to. So I try to distinguish postponement from procrastination, because sometimes people think that delay concept means I can delay doing things. It's about doing the things we need to do now and stepping out of the thinking that's the barrier to that doing.
That kind of falls into, though, that not tolerating those uncomfortable feelings, though, doesn't it? I've chosen that procrastination because I think it's going to feel worse if I make that phone call, even though I've called myself 3 days of worry about it.
And that can be a big underlying reason why we procrastinate. It is to avoid uncomfortable feelings. We anticipate whatever that thing is that we need to do is going to be aversive in some way. Can be all different sorts of feelings attached to it. And procrastination is our way of not having to therefore face those uncomfortable feelings. So procrastination can be a very effective short-term way of trying to avoid those feelings, but long-term, we know it actually ends up just making that situation worse, making the feelings that we do have to face kind of worse for ourselves. It makes the task even more aversive the more we put it off. But I think trying to avoid discomfort is a big driving factor in procrastination.
Because it's not just laziness, though, is it? I think some people think that procrastination is just you're too lazy to do this thing.
No, absolutely not. I think there can be many things that we're concerned about, and it can be that we fear the outcome of what's going to happen, or we fear that we might not do well at something, that we're not capable, or we feel we're not up to the task in some way, we'll fail at something. It can also even be things, depending on what the task is, that we have a lot of trouble tolerating boredom. And, sometimes tasks we have to do are boring and we have to sort of face and tolerate that boredom, and that can be an uncomfortable emotion as well. So I think, blaming procrastination on laziness isn't really appreciating the psychological factors that underlie it. And really, at the end of the day, it is about trying to avoid distress.
So this idea of postponing thoughts, when I first started kind of thinking about it, I thought,
it's not like the same way I postpone my bills.
No. Well, is it denial, is it just kind of squashing things down? But, clearly from what Lisa's telling us, it's not that. It's actually saying, okay, I'm going to bracket this for now. I'm going to put it into a box and I'm going to think of this later, because it's okay to think about it later because you're going to do something with it later. I mean, clearly with the stuff that I've been dealing with, I've been putting that away in a box for quite a significant amount of time, probably with never any kind of intention to deal with it. But here I am.
Here, the box has turned into a dump yard, and here you are.
Look, suffice to say, it went from a box to a whole crate and then probably a shipping container. But, now I'm sitting with a situation where I'm looking at the way that these relatives behave that, I've had issues with. And I'm looking at the fact that our relationship won't be the same. And I'm okay with that because the way the relationship was, I was subordinate. I was always kind of saying uncle. I was actually always the one to give over, to let it blow over, to just not actually say what was important for me. The other important thing that came up recently with my therapist, I don't even want my therapist.
With my therapist.
That came up recently with my therapist is that the question around being okay with things that aren't okay, because for me, that hits right on that family value. If there's a conflict, you have to resolve it because families should get along and families stick together. Yeah. But what if someone in your family treats you really badly? Do you still owe them the privilege of continuing that behavior? Do you still go, oh, that's all right. It's okay. We'll just forget it. We won't do it. No, not at all. I'd rather completely cut off that limb of the tree than to go through any of that ever again, hand on heart, or at least limit the relationship, because it becomes a situation where you're in that relationship out of duty because someone somewhere along the line said that blood's thicker than water, and then someone hearing that felt that because of that, it's okay to treat people like shit, and it's not.
No, not at all.
Even when I was in high school, so coming back to Mum, I spoke about her earlier, and she'd say to me, oh, look, you worry too much. I was the worry wart. I'd always be anxious about something or worried about something, and she'd say, focus on the positive. It'll be okay.
Yeah.
Classic toxic positivity. And my mum was beautiful. She didn't mean it maliciously, but that's kind of the best that she knew how to actually deal with those rotten situations.
But did it work? Didn't work, did it?
No, even then I knew it didn't work.
You can't tell someone not to worry and you just keep on worrying.
No, exactly.
You just stop saying it out loud.
So, and it might be something simple like, oh, I'm really worried about this exam, which everybody gets worried about exams when they're studying.
Yeah.
Rather than say, you worry too much, stop worrying, you'll be fine. Maybe something like, okay, have you actually gone over all the material you need to? And are you confident that you've actually covered everything in your revision?
Yeah, it'd be more useful to sit with it and then make a rational conclusion once you've looked at the actual facts, because, feelings aren't facts.
No, they're not. And, maybe those feelings of worry that I had was something in me saying I've missed something.
Yeah.
So when you're in a situation like an exam or even putting in an assignment for a course that you're doing, they'll tell you what they're looking for and what to look out for. So that gives you some indication of what you need to be revising or what you need to be putting into that assignment so that you know that you're going to be happy with the mark that comes back from that. And, you'll never know if it's going to be perfect. And we've had conversations about perfection before. So,
and we will have many more after that.
I'm sure we will, on and offline. But the point is, just to say stop worrying isn't enough. Yes, I'll stop worrying when I know how to stop worrying. So what's going to make me stop worrying is probably the more useful question in that part of it.
And how can that be helpful too? Like you said, with the worry, you realise that if you did have that worry, maybe it was because you forgot something. So it can be useful feedback.
Absolutely it can. And if you go through the logical steps of saying, okay, well, I have actually literally covered everything I need to cover here and I'm confident that I know it, then either the worry will stop or it's not that you're worrying about. It's useful to sit with things. That's how I kind of reflect on what sitting with it means. It's actually saying, okay, well, I'm feeling this. I'm not comfortable with it, but what's this about? Why am I feeling this? Sometimes you need help to explore that, though. Sometimes it's a bigger question than what we're actually brave or even capable enough of actually uncovering.
You mean sometimes it's more than two podcast hosts sitting here talking about their trauma?
I can't recommend therapy highly enough.
I know. I think that's that. We're talking at you. It's much better to talk to a therapist who will listen and help you with your specific situation. And I also can't recommend it highly enough as well.
And you've got to find the right one as well. Like not every therapist is going to fit you. And that's not a poor reflection on them. It's just that we all have different ways of relating.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to kind of just try it out. And if you go to one and it doesn't work out, then try someone else. It's never bad to talk. Never bad.
I mean, unless it's about Zootopia porn, you had a problem with that.
Well, no sloths. No sloths. No. Why did they leave the sloths out? That's what I want to know.
I'll go searching for it later then. Too slow. I don't know. I feel like Flash would be good at some foreplay though.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Okay, we're talking about emotion. We're talking about sitting with the emotion, and we're talking about on our crusade against toxic positivity.
Yeah.
So the opposite of toxic positivity then is genuine optimism. When you...
Can I, before you go into that, sorry.
Yeah.
I just meant to say one more thing.
Is it about Flash?
No, it's not about Flash. So, although, you know, sometimes I feel like Flash when I'm sitting there pondering my thoughts. But coming back to, like, you know, like in the trajectory of the stories that we're telling in this series, you know, I've been speaking a bit about my mum and stuff today, and that's separate to the main story, you know, of this family trauma and all this kind of stuff that went down. So, you know, I'm in a place now where I can't just ignore it. And I can't just tell myself it's going to get better. And I can't change that relative's view on how I live or who I am. Better yet, I don't feel the desire anymore to try. It's better for me to release that toxic positivity and move on.
That feels like catharsis. That's the turning point.
Act 3.
Well, if you get a turning point in this bit, I want a turning point in this bit.
You can have a turning point.
Be jealous? Jealous of your turning point?
What's your turning point?
Oh, I think my turning point.
Show us your turning point.
Show us your turning point.
Show us your turning point.
Oh, okay. Then the turning point of my story arc then of this, last year or so of recording this series is accepting the validity of all of my emotions and taking the judgment out of them. By allowing myself to experience them without judgment, I've been able to uncover and really get to know who I am authentically. And so that is a turning point, I think, because I can't stress enough how hard it was for me before to feel.
And to actually allow yourself to.
You remember when, you'll remember this, our listeners won't remember this because they weren't there, but you remember the first few times that we were on Zoom and we would do what we called Therapy Tuesday, which just happened any day, because recording Reframe of Mind and recording a lot of these things, these stories at the time, not our stories, but even the stories of our guests, it brought up a lot of emotions for us.
Yeah, it did.
It really hit home on a lot of things. And you'll remember that the first few times that we had the trauma Thursdays or the therapy Thursdays, how I felt like I couldn't cry on the Zoom. Like, you can't see me cry. Don't see me cry. I don't want you to see me.
Yeah.
Because crying is weak.
Yeah.
And that's not a true statement, but that's what I felt, that showing that emotion was weak. We don't cry, because if you cry, then someone has won. If it's someone saying something cruel to you and then you cry, then
they've got the better of you.
They got the better of you and they won, or you let it get to you, or if you show emotion, if you show vulnerability, that someone's going to use that against you. And there's an unconscious belief that I picked up from many years of career in the media, is that if you ever show someone that slither of vulnerability, as much as it seems like it's okay at the time, it will come back out later and be wielded as a weapon. And so, yeah, those first times, and like for a long time, I didn't feel comfortable. But I think that turning point was that acknowledgement that all emotion is feedback and is valid, and I don't have to be ashamed for having emotion, and I don't have to be angry for having emotion, even if it's negative or positive. And it is okay to cry and it's okay to feel things, and
it's healthy,
and actually accept that's a turning point, because that has monumentally changed my experience. Like, now we get on the Zoom, and if it's a Therapy Tuesday, I have no problem bursting into tears about something. You know, we were talking to a client.
And I'm they're going, just cry.
We're talking to a client like not long ago, and then she said something really kind, and I'm like, and I never would have done that back in a radio career. Ever would have considered that. I never would have considered asking for help at wherever. Well,
you would have gone over
your
break. You would have gone past the time allocated for your little talk break.
Oh yeah,
I count for tears in them.
I never would have cried on a podcast, and we've had some episodes where it's been quite so yeah. That's how I took your segment and made it about me.
Well done. So, like through the conversations that we've had, and also with the one we've had specifically with Dr. Happy, Tim Sharp, he's helped us to really come to an understanding of how toxic positivity is passive, whereas optimism is active.
When we experience something like, say, we have a goal, we've set a goal, and then we reach that goal, we expect that that's going to make us really happy. We've put all this pressure on it, but quite often it doesn't. Is that because our expectations around happiness are wrong?
One of the biggest problems that people experience when they think about happiness is having unrealistic expectations. There's no doubt about it. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. I mean, we're sold on realistic expectations by advertisers and marketers all the time. And in fact, what a lot of that leads to is a problem that I talk a lot about, which is the tyranny of when. And we've all done this at times. I'll be happy when.
Yes.
I'll be happy when I've achieved that goal, when I've lost weight or made more money or kicked that goal, or when I've got that fancy new car or the new iPhone or whatever. And that's highly problematic because we know in a number of ways. One, that often those expectations are unrealistic. So we're just sort of setting ourselves up for failure. But also we know, particularly when those things are tied to external factors, that's not where you'll find happiness, particularly in material possessions. Now, I often find I'm qualifying myself here because there's nothing inherently wrong with material possessions. There's nothing inherently wrong with wanting or liking a new tech gadget or a new jacket or shirt or whatever it might be. These aren't bad things, but they can be problematic if our expectations of what they will bring us are unrealistic. And we know for a fact that they won't bring us nearly as much happiness as we think they will, and certainly not for as long. And this is what we find, to go back to your question, it's similar with goals. Achieving a goal is not a bad thing. In fact, it's a very good thing. We can get a sense of satisfaction and pride, but we also need to understand that won't last for very long because by nature, we'll move on to the next thing. That's just who we are as humans. We're constantly moving forward. And again, that's not a bad thing. So the remedy to that, and this is a bit of a cliche, but is trying to enjoy the journey along the way. There's nothing wrong with getting to the end of the journey. There's nothing wrong with getting to the top of that mountain or whatever. In fact, those things are good things. We know setting and working towards meaningful goals is a path to happiness, but we need to enjoy the path as well. And this is where a lot of us do go wrong. We don't enjoy the process. We're not mindful. We're not present each and every minute and each and every day. So we miss out on a hell of a lot.
So back to the idea of postponing our thoughts. I know you said that first time you heard it, you thought maybe it means denying it. But Lisa Saulsman, our CBT therapist, went into more depth about how it actually works. So when we do postpone, in a positive way. How do we actually cut that off in our mind and say, yes, we are going to postpone this. I'm going to think about it at 7:00 tonight when I feel better, and then not spend the next 7 hours going, I'm not going to think about that thing that I'm thinking about.
Yeah, and I think it's about acknowledging that the thought is there and accepting that that initial thought is there, but you're making a decision to not get caught in the excessive thinking at that point in time. So you might need to keep postponing the same thing. And, there's a kind of a cool app, I don't know if you've seen it, the Worry Time app, which is through reachout.com. It's called Worry Time, and it is about worry postponement. And that's a really kind of nifty app where people can actually just record in just a couple of words, like what the worry is or what the thought is. It's always good just to write it down very briefly. Sometimes if people write too much when they're kind of postponing their thoughts, they can kind of accidentally kind of just get into doing lots of worrying at that time. So just jot a couple of words down to remind yourself of what the concern was, and it kind of locks it away. And then if that concern pops up, you can just kind of almost tick it sort of thing that, it's just registering. It's come up again, but, I'll see you at 7:00 kind of thing. 7:00 is kind of when I'll deal with you later on. And then when you come to it later on, it will give you your worries for the day, and you can it's kind of neat. You can kind of scrunch them. It's like the worries on a little piece of paper on the screen. You kind of scrunch it with your fingers and flick it off the screen if it's not important to you anymore. Or for those things that are still important, then it prompts you to what actions could I take with this? So it tries to channel your thinking into more action, problem-solving oriented thinking rather than just repetitive negative thinking.
I love the idea of putting all the worries on a to-do list.
And I do think, actually writing, so old school is to have a little notepad that you carry around and just jot it down. New school is to kind of use an app to do that. But it's sort of signaling, I know you're there and it's okay that you've popped up, but later is when I'm going to give you my time and attention. And, sometimes to bring a bit of humour to that, I kind of find, with a client, I might be working with a metaphor that might work for them that helps them to sort of detach from their thoughts in the moment. So I remember clients that have come up with the idea that, their worrisome thoughts are like a seagull squawking for a chip. That the seagull wants your attention, and what happens if you feed it a chip? More seagulls come kind of thing. So the idea that it's just that seagull squawking and I'll deal with it at 7:00. For me, I have a little character that I refer to. I call her Worrying Wilma. And so that's, when I notice I'm having a worrying thought, I'm sort of like, oh, hey, Wilma, how you doing? And just jot it down in my app and, lock it away for 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock happens to be my thinking time. When I can
I'm glad we picked the same thinking time.
I don't know why. 7 seems to be a thing.
Have some dinner, then get into some worry.
That's right, yeah. And it's not necessarily that you have to worry, it's that you can reevaluate whether they're worth thinking more about. And if they are worth thinking more about, how can you do it in a helpful kind of, like I said, problem-solving way rather than just rehashing kind of negative themes over and over again in your mind?
I feel like this is different from a technique that might be unhelpful that I use, which is if I experience a negative emotion, like something that is quite overpowering, not necessarily worry, I'll almost imagine like sticking it in a box and throwing it under the bed. And then I think maybe that's more suppressing the way that I feel. Like I don't ever want to open that box back up again. I'm not looking at it at 7 o'clock. So I just thought maybe we should make the distinction in that this is not that.
Yeah. And I think that's often a thing we need to consider, like, because sometimes people use postponement with the expectation the thought will go away and it will get rid of things. So again, that's kind of a form of suppression. It's a form of pushing away. But it really is about this accepting the thought is there, but making an active choice as to when you're going to engage with it or not. The idea of the box, often if we're working with children, they might have a worry box where they kind of jot it on a post-it note what their worry is and stick it in the pretty box that they've decorated so they can look at it later on. And that often people might want to avoid looking at things later on. But I'd encourage people to kind of go, well, when you revisit things, are they all still important? Are they all still relevant? Look, and if, putting it in the box and putting it away helps you to kind of not engage with it and there's no downside, then maybe that's helpful for you. But if it keeps coming back and keeps being a struggle, chances are that is becoming a form of suppression. That's why it's not working, because we know that thought suppression generally doesn't work for people.
Oh, I'd say there's definitely a downside when it comes back to bite me in the arse a year later after I haven't thought about it, and then and then I'm triggered by all sorts of things. It definitely doesn't work. I wonder if there's the opportunity then for, like, creating that worry to-do list. Could we do something similar where we create a positive thoughts, positive things that have come into our head, write them down and then revisit them at 8 o'clock instead?
Yeah, I think that's a lovely idea. Often something I encourage clients to do at the end of the day is to, have some sort of a little notebook that they do collect some of the positives, some of their strengths or positive qualities or positive things that have happened in the day, with that idea that our mind isn't very good at looking at the positive. Its evolutionary design would mean that it only hones in on the negative. So to purposely turn our attention to the positive, I think, is actually really important, and to recognise our strengths and our achievements, even just the little things or things that we might be grateful for, I think is a really worthwhile way to utilise our attention. I guess that's kind of what it comes back to, is where we're focusing our attention, where we're focusing our energy. So yeah, I would agree that to counterbalance that natural default that we have to see the negative, then purposely tuning into some of the positive highlights of our days and our weeks is actually really important.
So how does Dr. Happy make sure he's happy from day to day?
What does Dr. Happy do in a day to make sure that he is happy?
Well, one of the first things I do is accept that I won't be happy every day, and I won't be happy every minute of every day, that's for sure. But there are some things, there's definitely some things I do. I'm happy to share them with him, but I will preface this by, it might sound simple, but really important statement that we're all different. So what works for me might not work for you or anyone else out there listening. However, that being said, we have more in common than we think sometimes. So there are some, there are definitely general principles that we know work for most people most of the time. So the things that I do that work for me, I'm always trying to set and work towards meaningful goals. So for me, achievement and accomplishment is important. I think it is for all of us, but for me, maybe a bit more so. I need to be careful with that because that can have a dark side, I suppose. So at the moment, I'm writing another book, so I'll try to get at least a few words down, hopefully a chapter down or whatever, and I feel good when I've done that. So setting and working towards meaningful goals is important. For me, my physical health and well-being is also vitally important. So I exercise pretty much every day, and that's for a couple of reasons. I mean, there's obviously physical benefits associated with exercise, which I'm sure you know about. But for me, what's just as, if not more important, are the psychological benefits. For me, exercise is a stress buster. It's an antidepressant. It's a mood booster. So I genuinely feel better emotionally when I exercise on a regular basis. In the same way, I try to meditate every day and practice mindfulness. Sometimes it might only be 5 or 10 minutes. Sometimes it's a bit longer. But again, we know there's bucket loads of research and there's different ways you can do it. So different things will work for different people. but for me, that's an important part of trying to manage some, my monkey mind, my busy mind that can get a bit out of control sometimes. So that's another habit that I try to practice on a regular basis. Some of the other things that I know are good for me, but I find a bit harder are, and this might sound a bit strange, but connecting with other people. I'm actually quite an introvert, despite the fact that I spend quite a bit of my time on stage talking to thousands of people. I'm sometimes too happy sitting in a corner reading a book. That's one of my favourite things to do. And I do love that. And that's an important part of my happiness as well, is reading. But almost everything has a dark side. And the dark side is that I can get sucked down into being isolated and alone too much of the time, which can also mean getting sucked into being too much time inside my own head, which is a pretty scary place at times, I'll tell you. So what comes easily for some people, socialising, comes a bit harder for me. But I know that if I just force myself, and it doesn't always take a lot of effort, but I know that that's important for me to just get out, to be with people, to interact with friends and family and colleagues, etc. So they're probably the main ones. And then there's lots of other. One thing that I would love to do more of, and maybe I'll get some tips, is to develop more hobbies. I've never actually... well, apart from reading, maybe, that's something I've kind of always struggled with a bit. And yet I know it would be good for me. I know, well, one thing I suppose is I do love bushwalking and getting out in nature, but I make an effort to try to do that as best I can. But I would love to have some recreational hobby. And one thing that you touched on this earlier, which is really interesting, one of the things we know from the research is important. One of the things that I think I could benefit from is spending time in activities with no real goal. And that's sort of one of the definitions of hobbies or of play, is pleasurable activity without any specific outcome. And I know that would be beneficial for me because too often I do focus on outcomes. That's probably driven some of my quote unquote success, but it also has a dark side as well. And I think certainly one of the things I'm trying to do more of is just do stuff without trying to be good at it, without wanting to succeed or have any outcome whatsoever. So yeah, there's a few ideas that might help some of you.
You're not alone in being the extroverted introvert. I've found that in my career as well. Stand on stage comfortably with 5,000 people in an audience, but put me with 10 people at a pub and I will hide in the corner and not want to make small talk.
People often ask me about that. So when I spent a lot of my time in the last decade or two speaking at conferences and events, people say, how do you do that? And I say, well, it's actually not me up there, it's Dr. Happy. And that's been one of I didn't call myself Dr. Happy, as a colleague called me that years ago, and I was quite reluctant to accept it, but I eventually did sort of embrace it because it's almost like this alter ego, this other persona, like a lot of performers will have a stage name or writers will have a pen name, whatever. And so when I get up there, I feel like it's a bit of a protection in a way. And that helps me. It's not really Tim Sharp up there. It's Dr. Happy. And he's almost like this other person that I can kind of hide behind a bit.
So as uncomfortable as it may be sometimes, the idea of sitting with thoughts and feelings, it's the key to ending toxic positivity. And a good counsellor, a good therapist is going to be able to help you do this.
Yeah.
Lisa Saulsman explains the benefit of doing it authentically.
I really like that idea of breathing into that feeling of how you're feeling, because I know from personal experiences that often breathing, as you say, is used to try and deflect or to remove from the situation. But what you're describing there is actually trying to stay with it.
Yeah, and because I think that really anything, I'm thinking now more in a therapy kind of setting, but I think any kind of strategy or technique that we might teach a client we might be working with can kind of be misused as a form of trying to suppress our thoughts and feelings. He'll do this and it'll take away the bad feeling or the negative thoughts or what have you. I think the idea of trying to do the different things we might be doing, but actually more within a spirit of being able to accept how we're feeling, be able to kind of accept that we're having this thought, but not buy into it so intently and listen to it so intently right now, for example. So I think I'm a big believer that it's not just what you do, it's the spirit or attitude within which you do it. So I try to have that spirit and attitude that I'm using the breathing to cope with the feeling, like I said, make space for it, breathe into it, not to try and get rid of it and suppress it and take it away, because we know that if that's our kind of overarching attitude, it's usually going to backfire on us in some way, and it's actually just going to kind of continue the struggle that we might have.
Oh, so now that we've learned how to combat the tendencies of toxic positivity, we're probably going to be dealing with some big emotions.
Weren't we already dealing with big emotion this episode?
I know.
I didn't cry.
You weren't.
No, sorry. Next time I'll bring out the tears.
Well, we weren't dealing with the big emotions. That's the thing. So now that we've actually kind of identified that, we do need to sit with it. And even if we put off thinking about it, we're still going to think about it and we're still going to deal with them.
We have to at some point. Yeah.
We have to.
Otherwise it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger until you shit your career out.
Next time on Reframe of Mind, we can't go from shitting that out to Maree.
Okay, so it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger until you implode. And then you got to deal with it one way or another.
You do.
If you're going to keep putting it in the box under the bed until the box becomes a crate and the crate becomes a storage container and the storage container becomes a small explosion, you got to deal with it at some point.
So next time on Reframe of Mind, author and director of Positive Minds Australia, Maree Teesson helps us dig a little bit deeper into how feelings work and how to deal with those big emotions.
Everyone wants to feel good, and we feel our best when we're calm. When you're in a calm state of mind, everything else flows so much better.
If you are concerned about yourself or someone you know, please seek professional advice and support. You can contact Beyond Blue on 1300 224 636 or at beyondblue.org.au.
Or you can contact Lifeline on 131114 or at lifeline.org.au.
You've been hearing our story and now we really want to hear yours.
Connect with @Reframe of Mind on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok and Twitter.
Or connect with @Welcome Change Media on LinkedIn.
You can also contact us via reframeofmind.com.au with your stories or suggestions for future topics.
We'd like to thank today's guests for sharing their personal stories and insights. For more information on any of the subjects, guests or references used in this episode, please see our show notes or reframeofmind.com.au.
Reframe of Mind is a Welcome Change Media production.